All right. With the help of Hashem, we are learning Pesachim Daf Lamed Vav. Before we begin giving a quick overview to the Daf, I just would like to make a correction to that which we ended up learning yesterday. The question in the Braisa, whether tevel can be used for matzah. And I mentioned it's a mitzvah haba ba'aveda. Actually, that's a big problem, because since L'chura is a mitzvah haba ba'aveda, as all of the Rishonim speak out, then why did we need to have a special limud from the hekesh of loiseichel olav chametz, right? Call me sheisura mishum bal toichel olav chametz. That's what you can use for matzah, but tevel is prohibited because of tevel, and then we learned that goes according to Rab Shimon that ein isur halal isur. Why isn't it obvious that we cannot make matzah out of tevel because it is a mitzvah haba ba'aveda? And there are many approaches that are given by the Rishonim. Just to quote the Ritva, which is a Gavaldik Yechidish, who says that mitzvah haba ba'aveda is only a problem when the mitzvah cannot be done without the person violating an aveda. Just an example: a person steals something, they would not have had it had they not stolen it. They would not have had it at all. Masha'en came over here, being that a person is always able to separate the trumas u'maises from the tevel. Obviously, they should not be eating the tevel, but they would be able to fulfill the mitzvah of matzah independent, right? Even if they would not have been sinning, so that's not called a mitzvah haba ba'aveda. And as well as many other approaches amongst other Rishonim, indeed, tevel may not be used for matzah because of the specific limud as we had at the end of yesterday's daf. Now, today we will continue, as we also mentioned, I think after we went offline, what we were speaking about. The Mishnah was addressing Ma'aser Sheni outside Yerushalayim. What about making matzah from Chitei Ma'aser Sheni to eat it in Yerushalayim? We're going to see that it's really a machlokes tanoim, whether that's permissible or not. We're going to learn the shita of Rabbi Akiva regarding the ashira, whether matzah dough that's kneaded with wine, with oil, with honey, whether that's a valid matzah for the mitzvah of matzah or not. We're going to be learning about making matzah with milk, with dairy. Bachlal, we're going to go back to that which we learned on Daf Lamed, that there is an Isur D'Rabbanan to make Bachlal bread, dairy bread, as well as making fleishike bread. But today's Daf is going to focus more on the dairy bread. We're going to learn the exception for it. We're going to learn the Machlokes Rishonim, how to understand and therefore how to apply that exception. And we're going to also ask whether Bikurim is from the Shivas Haminim, which includes Chitim and So'irim, whether a Kohen can make out of his bikurim matzah and fulfill the mitzvah of matzah. Really, it's contingent to the machlokes tanoim whether an oinen is permitted to eat bikurim or not. When it comes to Ma'aser Sheni, that's a beferish pasuk that an oinen may not consume Ma'aser Sheni. That's part of the vidui Ma'aser that we have in Parshas Kisavai, that lo yochalto mimeni va'oini. About bikurim, we're going to learn more about the meaning of lechem oini, and God willing, if we'll have time, mamash at the end of Lamed Vav Amud Beis, we're going to have a braisa that appears to be addressing the thickness of the matzah. We'll see whether indeed that's the issue. In other words, there's a machlokes b'shama and b'silul, and it appears that whether matzah is thick a tefach, whether that in itself invalidates that to be used as matzah because of the chashash that maybe it's not going to be thoroughly baked, and therefore you might have a chashash chametz. And then we're going to have the actual understanding of that braisa, that the braisa speaking about thickness is really not addressing a Pesach issue. It's addressing a more general Yom Tov issue. It's not speaking about the thickness of a loaf, but it's speaking about filling up an oven on Yom Tov, baking bread, filling it up, even though you only need, let's say, one loaf, but you're going to fill up the oven with 10 loaves. And that's about, are you allowed to do tircha yesera on Yom Tov? And the answer is, of course, not. But especially in the ovens of old, the fuller the oven, the more equalizing effect it had on spreading the heat within the oven, and therefore the better each bread was baked. So that your bread that you need on Yom Tov will be better baked if it's in an oven that's filled with other loaves. That's the heter of Beis Hillel, and maybe we'll speak out whether that Bechlal is Shaykh in modern days ovens or not, and a lot more. We're going to start on Daf Lamed Vav Amud Aleph, 6 lines from the top of the Am, in the middle of the line, Tanach Rabbanan. All right, says the Braisa. Tanach Rabbanan. Danny, this is for you. You asked this question at the end of yesterday. One might think that if you are going to make matzah out of ma'aser sheni grains, and obviously eat it in Yerushalayim, you'll be yotzeh. Talmud Leimer. So when it says in the pasuk that we quoted yesterday, the pasuk that we used for the Hekesh in Parshas Re'eh, and when the pasuk speaks about eating matzah for 7 days, the Torah uses the words lechem oini. And by the way, it's important, not such a by the way, yes way, that oini is not written with a vav, but it's vowelized with a cholam, lechem oini. And what's the pshat of lechem oini? Says the Bach, just amending it from matemi, that mi shenechol ba'aninus, food, in our case grain, that is allowed to be eaten even when a person is in a state of aninus, which is in the highest state of grief, which happens after a person loses one of the 7 halachically closest relatives, God forbid, father, mother, brother, sister, son, daughter, spouse. Then you have an aninus midoraisa, which is on the day that the person lost that relative. Then you have aninus midrabanan that goes on even into the night, or perhaps even up until a burial. V'chulei, as we'll learn all the prati aninus and moed katan. But whenever it is that a person is an einin, there are certain restrictions. So food that even an einin can consume, that is what's valid for matzah. The matzahs have to be lechem, that an einin, we're making a play of words, we're going from an ayin to an aleph. Yatzah, and this comes to exclude ma'aser sheni, since she'eino nechel ba'aninus. One may not eat it when one is in a state of aninus. Elo b'simcha, you have to eat it in a state of a simcha. Now this is not debatable. This is an explicit pasuk that in Parshas Kisavai, when it comes to the 2 times in the 7 cycle, in 2 times during the Shemitah cycle years, where the person who not only has to separate the trumas or maasros to have the remaining of the food not tevel, but they're separating trumas or maasros, and then there is a second step of actually giving it to the proper recipients. The person has to separate it to eat the remainder, but you don't have to give it right away. However, Pesach time in the 4th year and in the 7th year, that is where the person has to make sure that everything that was separated was properly given, the Truma to the Kohen, the Levi, the Maiserishan to the Levi, etc. And after that happens, the person makes what we call a vidui maiser. They declared that they properly fulfilled all of the tithing's obligations, not only the separating, but also the giving it over. And one of the statements that the person makes is that lo yachalti mimenu ba'oini, lo yachalti ba'oini mimenu. That when I was in an oinen, God forbid, if the person was in an oinen, he never consumed, and that includes ma'aser sheni. And these are the words of Rabbi Yossi Aglili. However, Rabbi Akiva Oimer, not correct. And we had this already yesterday, that since throughout the Torah, when we speak about eating matzahs, the word matzahs is written many times, it's repeated many times, and there's a big machlokes amongst the Rishonim, exactly which word matzah are we referring to. But the words are matzos, riba. The Torah repeats the words matzos various times. That also is including that you could eat matzah made out of ma'aser sheni, obviously in Yerushalayim. What does Rabbi Akiva do? So as we learned yesterday, that the lechem oini, not like we learned today from Rabbi Yossi Haglili, is a remez regarding aninus ayin aleph. But oini pasha goes to the taich that it has to be the poor man's bread, or poor man's bread, not rich man's bread. What makes a bread a rich man's bread? When richness is added to the dough, prat le'isa, that if shenaloisha, either with wine, or with oil, or with dvash, that's not lechem oini, and that is not a valid food, valid bread to be yotzem, the mitzvah of matzah. Now, according to Rabbi Akiva, right, we have matzahs, marva, we have the lechem oini to exclude. So my Talmud Rabbi Akiva, he could have used it in the opposite direction. Maybe matzah should be marva, matzah ashira for the mitzvah. And let him use the oini to exclude ma'aser sheni aninus. So answers the Gemara, said Rabbi Akiva holds, mi ksiv lechem oini. Rashi says, if it would have written oini with a vav, you have to interchange the ayin and an aleph But other than that, yeah, Ani could have been written without the vav if it only would have meant poor. The fact that if the Torah would have added an and vav, that is already clear to be maramas aninus. But since it's written without a vav, ayin nun yud, so Rabbi Akiva is not going to learn that oini is from aninus, from grief. It's more mustaber for him that oini, it's taka pronounced oini, but it's taka from the word oni. And oni comes to exclude matzah shira. Rabbi Yossi Aglili doesn't care that it's written without a vav because he's focusing on how it's read. Right, the Kri Diksiv, mi korinon, ani, no, oini korinon, and therefore, yes, as a drush, I can go and I can learn out, I can interchange the ayin with an aleph. The Rabbi Akiva, korinon bay, adds the bach, the word bay. The Rabbi Akiva, hi, the korinon bay, oini, yeah, it's taka oini, but that's Kiddush Shmuel. There's something else that's learned from lechem oini, aside of on the excluding that you cannot use rich man's dough, rich man's bread. But oini is Kiddush Shmuel. So Amar Shmuel, lechem oini, lechem she'oinin olav dvarim harbe. That it is the lechem, the matzah, upon which a lot has to be said. What's the dvarim? Says Rashi here, very important. Rashi 11 times on the top of the Amid. She'goymidim olav as a halel. Wow, he mentions halel. And v'oimidim olav haggadah. As I mentioned, I think it was yesterday, that's the minig. When it says in the Rebbe's Haggadah, when it says in the Haggadah that you're supposed to uncover some of the matzah, and that's because of the concept of Shmuel, that matzah lechem she'oinin olav devarim harbe. I heard a gavaldik word that you have in all matzah and all bread, you really have all of the four elements. You have the eish is what you need to fire up the oven. And you have the afar, which is the grain itself, and you have the mayim. And what is the ruach in bread? The fact that it rose. But since matzah, that's the whole word of matzah, cannot be chametzik, so there's a lack of ruach. So the ruach in the bread is the words that you speak with the breath of your mouth that has to be all of dvarim harbe. Okay, weiter. Nukuda. Says the Gemara of Rabbi Akiva, as he learns oini from poor, excluding rich man's bread, that isa sheneloisha b'yayin, the shemen udvash, loy, it may not be used for the mitzvah. The Hatanya, we learned in a brayso a couple of opinions. Tanakama holds, ein loshin isa b'pesach b'yayin, the shemen udvash. Not only should you not do it, l'chatchila, but if you did need it on Pesach, Rabban Gamliel oimer tisaref miyad oigevalt. Now tisaref miyad, obviously, the issue is not about you fulfilling your mitzvah of achilas matzah, but this is about whether it becomes chametz. And he is of the opinion that when you add yain shemen udvash, not the shita that we learned mamash on top of lamed hayim at beis that may pay to say machmitzin. He holds the opposite. He holds that it becomes chametz very quickly. You don't have the 18 minutes that you have when you only mix the flour and the water. And the chashash of chametz is so much that you have to right away burn it. Tisaref miyad, oigevalt. And Rashi writes something very important, that the tisaref miyad of Rabban Gamliel is not on Yontiv itself, not only by Cholamoid and not on Yontiv. And really that's a whole discussion. Bishitas Rashi, or something that we also mentioned yesterday as a Havamina, there are certain things that become almost fully chametzik. It's called chametz noiksha. In other words, it's chametzik enough for you not to be allowed to eat it, but it's not bona fide chametz, and therefore you're not obligated to do the tashbisu as you have to normally do to chametz gamur, and that wachayt is going to be shitas Rashi, which is why on Yontiv itself don't burn it. But yes, burn it on Cholamoid. Anyways, Gamliel holds that adding yain shemen udvash actually makes it chametzik a lot quicker, and there's a chashash that it became, whether it is chametz gamur, whether it became karev l'chametz, but you got to get rid of it. The Chachamim say they agree that lachatchila don't add yain or shemen or dvash because it will make the chimutz process happen quicker, but it doesn't mean that it's going to happen. So if you already did it, then you can eat it. That's all b'diavad. Now a third shita, the Omar Rabbi Akiva, and this is going to be the state of Rabbi Akiva, that I want you to know that Shabbasi Hoysa Eitzel Rabbi Eliezer Rabbi Yeshua. I once spent, Shabbos here means Yom Tov, means Pesach. I once spent, I was Shovis together with the great Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua, and during Yom Tov, during Cholamoyed, I made bread. It can be during Yom Tov. Velashti Lahem Isa. And what did I make the dough out of? Flour and wine and oil or of davash. In other words, I did that lechatchila. And not only am I of the opinion that it could be done, and if I care, that is based on the sheet that we learned yesterday, that made peiros b'chlal ein machmitzim. It's like minakotza el akotza. It's not only that it's going to become chametz the quicker, it b'chlal won't become a chametz. And v'lo yomru li davar. And they did not protest. Now, even if it would have been only good b'di'evid, they would have told me, don't do it, but now that you did it, we can eat it. In other words, you can do it lechatchila. Now the Braisa continues, and obviously this continuation is not l'shitas Rabbi Akiva, that holds that you can eat it lechatchila. The Braisa says, v'afal pi she'ein loshin. That's according to one of the opinions we had above, but mikatfim boy, you can smear the surface with it. Kimin Hageno, whoever was involved in making challah, if you saw your mother making challah at the end of making everything nice before you put it into the oven, so something is smeared on top of the dough, so it should have like a nice look. That you could do with yain shem and udvash. Now the Gemara interrupts and says, it's not the hemshech Rabbi Akiva. This statement, ba'afal pisha ein loshin asan, that goes according to the Tanach. According to Rabbi Akiva, you can lechatchila knead a dough on Pesach with yain shem and udvash. And b'chachamim that no, meaning that if you can't do whatever you may not use to knead, right, like we said, because it's going to make it chametz dig very quickly, you can't use the smear either. Esh loshen boy mikatfim boy, and ve'esh ein loshen boy ein mikatfim boy. Okay, now this shavin, everyone is of the opinion that she'ein loshen asa isha b'poishin, that using lukewarm water to make a dough, that's something that's for sure prohibited. Here, like Rashi writes, because for sure, mimahad in lahachmitz, you're not going to have the normal 18 minutes. It's going to happen much quicker. And don't make a dough on Yom Tov in a way where you're going to have even less of the already limited amount of time. Bottom line is that Rabbi Akiva de facto he needed dough, and he did it in the presence of the greats, and no one protested against him, meaning Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua. So he's saying that you could make matzah with yain shem and udvash. So which one is it? So the Gemara says, hold on, there's no question here. There are two different topics. It's important to remember that. There is the obligation of eating matzah, the mitzvah chilas matzah, that you have the first night of the Seder, and then in Golus you have it on the second night of the Seder. That's what we were speaking about. That's lechem oini. And yet Rabbi Akiva teaches oini not from aninus, but from poor man's bread. And any dough, any bread that is made with richness, with oil, with shem, and with davash, is not qualified for the mitzvah of matzah. Seder. The Braisa that we just learned has nothing to do with you fulfilling the mitzvah. It has to do whether what you will do is going to turn it into chametz. The issur of eating chametz is for the entire Pesach. Like Hasha. The Yom Tov Rishon, that Rabbi Akiva holds you may not fulfill the mitzvah with what we call matzah ashira. And this Braisa is b'yom tov sheni. B'yom tov sheni doesn't mean it means the entirety of Yom Tov. And that's something when the issue is only not to eat chametz. And yes, Rabbi Akiva holds that may peiros are not machmitzim. And can the Amar Lahu Rabbi Yeshua, or you have the Bach says Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, Libanei to his children, that Yoim Akama, meaning for the Seder, Loi Talushali Bachalava, don't add milk in the dough. Then that's when you can't add milk. Same concept. The problem with adding milk to the dough, I know we learned some daf lamed, we're going to get to that in a moment. Forget about milchiks. The problem with adding milk to the dough is that it's not poor man's bread. Lechem oini, the way Rabbi Akiva's teaching from ani, is pashut flour and water and nothing else, including not milk. Now, during the rest of the Yom Tov, if he doesn't have to fulfill the mitzvah, then you can add the milk. So fine. So now that we made that clear, but let's for a moment focus on making milchika bread. Again, we just learned this on daf lamed. This is throughout the whole year. And the imlash, the Chachamim said that bread may not be eaten. Why? Because there's a possibility a person won't know that there's milchiks inside the bread, and they might eat it with fleishiks. Oh. So answers the Gemara. First of all, one version is that Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi Taka didn't mention milk. It was a mistaken girsa. Elohachi ka'amar yer mekama leitolishali bedufsha. Same kind. The problem with lechamoini versus matzah shira, difference. Milk. It was honey. The first white line. Then lushali bedufsha. In other words, there's no problem eating matzah shira on Pesach, right? If you hold that may pay the same machmitzin, it's only about the mitzvah of matzah that may not be done with matzah shira. Or the Ibayasema, no, that the Girsa was correct. And there are exceptions. We spoke this out on Daf Lamed. If you make a heket in the bread that you should know that it's milchiks or it's fleishiks, then it's okay. That Itakamend for the remaining of Pesach, they can add the machalava, they can add the milk. And Kida Amar Ravina, Ke'ein Toira Shari. Ravina said elsewhere that if you make it like the eye of an ox, we'll see what that means in a moment, then you are allowed to make it milchiks or fleishiks. Achinami, what Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi told his sons, that if it's not for the Seder, then make it obviously ke'ein toira. Make the bread like the eye of an ox. Now Rashi here says, what's ke'ein toira? Rashi teaches, ma'at, small pieces of bread, small loaves, ka'ayin shel shoir, like really small. Little shtikalach, like the eye of an ox. And that I'm reading inside Rashi, mutar lalush b'chalav. Why is that? Because the achalei miyad, because it's eaten right away. All of it is eaten right away. The basachas and v'loy mashilei the linshe shenilosh b'chalav. And you're not going to allow any of this bread that was kneaded with milk remaining over, which might drink the hergel aveda. That is Rashi. Other Rishonim say that ke'ein toira is not about the big or little. It's about the size of the loaf. It's about the form, not the size, the form of the loaf. I think someone mentioned to me that there's a certain bakery that they make triangular. When they make a pastry with milchiks, they make it triangular.
In Israel, the burekas are like that. All the burekas in Israel.
Here you go. That is based on the other Rishonim that ke'ein toira, not size but shape. In other words, there's an issur d'Rabbanan if it looks like a loaf. The moment you make a shinoi and everyone knows on that shape, it's milchiks or fleishiks, then that issur d'Rabbanan does not apply. Okay, so very good. Be clarified first of all. Ma'aser sheni. Okay, when we said yesterday at the end that you can have Ma'aser sheni matzahs in Yerushalayim, with Rabbi Akiva, but not according to Rabbi Yosef. Now we quoted the Braisa V'shavin. The Braisa that we were speaking about kneading flour with yain shemen or davash, whether it's going to be machmetzit quicker. So that was takamach loikas tanoim. But all of them agree she'ein lashon ha'seisha ba'poishrin, that if you're going to use lukewarm water versus cold water versus room temperature, if it's warmed a little bit, that's bad, because that's going to, like Rashi says, mimaharim lahachmetz. Says the Gemara, hold on. If that's the case, my shlomi menachos. Why don't we apply that by menachos? We mentioned that other than the very few exceptions, in the Beis HaMikdash, there were 2 exceptions. There were 10 of the 40 loaves by a carbon toida, that was taka chametzik. You have the shtei halechem that was brought on Shavuos with the shalmei tzibur that were chametzik. Other than that, all of the many menachos were not allowed to be chametz. Nevertheless, we learned in Mishnah menachos, says the Gemara, that kol ha-menachos niloishos ba'poishrin. They were actually kneaded with lukewarm water. Eloma, we're going to read with the emendation of the Meseiras Hashas that u'mishamran shelo yachmitzu. Taka, we know that there's a problem, but they made sure that it doesn't become chametzik. And here we're saying it was shavin she'ein lashon ha'seisha ba'poishrin. How do you reconcile that? Answers the Gemara. How can you compare the nachos that were made in the Beis HaMikdash under the supervision of the Kahanim and making matzah, which is done, especially when you have all these people that are machmer, they bake their own matzahs, they have no idea what they're doing. My Zaydi used to say that all of the people that bake their own matzah, that's mamash chametz. You buy it from the bakers, they have experience. So, or I'm just saying that I'm repeating what my Zayda. Obviously, if your minig is to make your own matzah, you are different, you know what you're doing.
Rabbi Taber said the same, by the way, when we left.
Mamish, that's my mother's father. Blessed memory. So answers the Gemara. Reason. The Mishnah Menachos is speaking about Kahanim are diligent. There's reason. How can you compare one case to the other? Matzahs are made by everyone. We're not Zirizin. We're not Kahanim. And therefore, no, don't use Pleishrim because you have a much smaller window frame before it turns Chametzik. If in the Beis Hamikdash you had zrizin, so now we have another kash. Why is it that in the Beis Hamikdash they would generally not soak the grains in water? That's called milsas. And now the advantage of soaking not the grains, the kernels. The advantage of soaking kernels in water before you pound it to remove the bran is that when you remove the bran, it's mamish, it's nucky. And the quality of fine flour in the Torah is moedediki. It's amazing. It's much better than whole wheat, which is considered something inferior. And if because of the zrizos of the Kahanim, they knew how to prevent things from becoming chametzik, so milsas nami lasis, why don't we allow the kernels to be soaked in water? And you're going to have a much clearer flour if you would do so. Alama, Amar Rabbi Zera, Amar Rabba Bar Yirmi, Amar Shmuel, that chitim shalmanach is in loisis because there's a hashash. Again, you're doing something which, again, normally without extra care will become a chametzik. So the Gemara answers, hold on, this soaking was done exactly where? He says, Lisha bizrizin isa. The kneading was done in the presence of the Kahanim. It didn't need to be done by the Kahanim, as the Gemara is going to point out, but it was done on the Beis Hamikdash. But Lesisa, whenever the soaking of the kernels was done, and even if it's going to be done to that which will become a Korban Mincha, is Leisa Bezrizin. It doesn't have to be done in the Beis Hamikdash. So in a Hanami, something that doesn't need to be done in the Beis Hamikdash, anything that could be Memahir Lahachmitz is something that we're not allowed to do. Says the Gemara, what you think the Kahanim, they were the ones that needed the dough, they themselves didn't have to do it. But as it says in the beginning of Vayikra, that the Yotzik Allah Hashem, then Ve'evi ala Koyen, and then, it's almost Iker Chasam in a Sefer, that's why you have on the side, he adds, and then Ve'evi al B'nei Ha'aron HaKahanim V'kamatz. In other words, when do the Kahanim get involved in a Korban Mincha? As it says, Mikamitzah Ve'elach Mitzvah Mikahona. Which means limei that all of the various steps that was done prior to the kemitza, which is the yitzika, which is the pouring of the oil on it, which is the belila, the mixing, or at least kol haroya lebila, all of that is ksheder b'chol adam. In other words, the kneading did not be done by Omri. So Vaited, and if you're telling me that kneading the poishin is a chashash chametz, it's not done by this reason. So the Gemara says you're right. That Lisha and the Heed, the Bezrizin Leisa, it wasn't done by the Kahanim that are diligent, but the meeting needed to be done in the Beis Hamikdash. It was b'makayim Zrizin Isa, the Amar Mar, the Lila Kesheda Bazar, but Chutz L'Chemes Azar Psula. Now, Lesisa, the soaking, did not even have to happen in the Holy Temple. Lafuke Lesisa, not only did it not need to be done by this reason, but more importantly, reason. So what we need is really, where are you doing it? I don't care if you're not the expert. Anything that's done dafk in the Beis Hamikdash has that additional guarantee, that additional hashgacha of the kohanim that are zrizin. So the Pesachim is not a problem because Lisha is not in the Beis Hamikdash, and Lasisa, which need not be done even in the Makam of the Mikdash, there, yeah, so even if it's going for Korban Mincha, we're chayish that it might become chametzik. Now, Umayshna mi Mincha Sa'omer, the Tanya Mincha Sa'omer, yes, losses and I say, those barleys were soaked, and then it was piled. We just said that Lesisa is not done. So here the answer is Tzibur Shani, like Rashi writes under the first white line, that the Mincha So'emet is a Korban Tzibur, Rashi says, and V'chol Asakin Shalah, everything is done al pi Beis Din, even the cutting, the harvesting of it, V'chule, and therefore, since everything is done under rabbinic supervision, we're not even concerned that they're going to make a mistake by the lasisa of allowing it to become chametzik. And therefore, yeah, in that case, since it becomes a clearer, cleaner flour, they take even did lasisa. Okay, go on. So now we are going to Ingen. So the first topic today was Ma'aser Sheni, Achloikes Tanoim. Now we're going to have another question, which is whether Bikurim has the Kedusha of Truma. Now the Mishnah said that Truma could be used for matzah. Clearly, Challah can be used, V'kahanim b'Challah b'Truma. But guys, don't forget that Challah and Truma can be eaten anywhere by the kohen. And indeed, they can make matzah out of it, and they can use it for the mitzvah of matzah. Says the Braisa, Yachal, you would think that Yoitza Adam, Yidei Chayvasa Bibikurim, the Adam doesn't mean any Adam. The Adam must mean Kayhanim, because again, this is not like Maisa Sheni that anyone can eat it. No, Bikurim is only to be consumed by Kayhanim. But Kayhanim can make matzahs out of Truma, they can make it out of Challah, maybe they can make it out of Bikurim. So Talmud Leimer, this is in Parshas Boy, it says, B'choil moishvoisechem toichlu matzahs. In all of your gates and all of your cities, meaning matzah, hanecheles, b'chol moishvoisechem, even if it's limited only for kahanim, it's truma. But it has to be something that could be consumed anywhere. Yatsa bikurim, since she'ein necholam b'chol moishvoisechem ela b'Yerushalayim, so it's excluded from this pasuk in Parshas Boy, Divrei Rabbi Yossi HaGlili. Now, unlike the first machlekes we learned today, where Rabbi Akiva argues with Rabbi Yossi HaGlili, in the din, here, the second to last line of the Amid, Rabbi Akiva agrees with the din. Bikurim, you can't make matzahs out of bikurim and be yoytze the mitzvah. Fine. The question is, right, Mashmar's Dorshan Ikebenayo, where do you learn it from? Rabbi Akiva Oimed, that I learn it from matzah u'maror. Rashi writes 2 lines before the bottom of the Amid that Rabbi Akiva is referring to a pasuk in Parshas Baha Aloischa. Really, it's about Pesach Sheni. But the Torah, excuse me, uses the words al matzos u'maroidim yoichluhu. Al matzos u'maroidim is hekish, juxtaposed. So what do we learn from the hekish? Ma moror, right back inside the Gemara and back inside the words of Rabbi Akiva, is she'enoi bikurim. Moror is what is a vegetable? There was no bikurim from vegetables. Af matzah she'enoi bikurim. Rabbi Akiva is asking on his own limud. Let's say further. Ma moror she'en b'minoi bikurim. In other words, no species of moror, no species. Not that this moror does not bikurim. The species of vegetables are never used in bikurim. So why don't we say further? Af matzah she'ein b'mina bikurim. Matzah should not be allowed to be made out of something, one of the types or 2 of the types of grains that are to be bikurim, which means daf lamed vav amid beis, which would mean that we should b'chlal not be allowed to have matzah not from chitim nor from sa'odim, because chitim and sa'odim, what these are 2 of the shivas haminim, sheyesh b'minam bikurim. Now, in other words, that would mean that maybe matzah should only be from either spelt, right, kusmin, which is like a subcategory, but it's not direct chitim, or from rye oats. That should be the only 3 types, 3 grains, not the 5 grains that are mentioned in the Mishnah. So for that, says Rabbi Akiva, Talmud Leimer, again we have matzos. The Torah repeats matzos many times. That comes to include even not bikurim, but b'minam, the chitim is good. As long as this is not bikurim, it's good. So then go further. Then afilu bikurim nami. So it says the Gemara statement, you know what? If Rabbi Akiva would have stood his ground, if he would have learned it from the Hekish, then you're right. Because once we are using matzahs to be marbe, minei chitim, bibikurim, he should have gone even more. It must be that Hadebe Rabbi Akiva, that Rabbi Akiva rejected, he retracted from his Hekish, not from his din, fakir. He will learn the reason why bikurim cannot be used for matzah from Rabbi Yossi HaGlili's limud, where it says in Boy, B'choil moishvoisechem, and that's something else. B'chol moishvoisechem. And bikurim cannot be eaten, but it's not like challah, it's not like truma. It's not about that it can only be eaten by the kohen. It's that bikurim must be consumed in Yerushalayim, and that will exclude, even according to Rabbi Akiva, that is the limit from where we exclude bikurim and matzah. How do I know that Rabbi Akiva changed his mind? Because we're going to quote a brisa, and even though this brisa is not authored, it doesn't say Divrei Rabbi Akiva, we're going to see that this must be dafke shitas Rabbi Akiva, and this will be the limit in the brisa. The Tanya. So we're quoting now what we had on Amud Aleph in the name of Rabbi Yossi HaGlili. Teaching you that matzah hanecheles b'chol moishavos, matzah can be, you can fulfill the mitzvah with a food that may be eaten in all of your dwellings, anywhere. Yatzu bikurim she'enim b'chol moishavos. It can only be eaten in Yerushalayim. So Yachol Shani Moitzes Af Ma'aser Sheni. Now, by the way, Rabbi Yosef Glili Taka holds that Ma'aser Sheni cannot be used for matzah. He learns it out from the Lechamoini, from Aninus. But this Bryce is authored by those who hold, which is Rabbi Akiva, that Ma'aser Sheni could be used for matzah. Oh, now, and why? Because Ma'aser Sheni can only be consumed in Yerushalayim as well. So says the Bryce, no, Talmud Loimer Matzahs Matzahs. Matzahs Matzahs is being marva. So Umara Isal Rabbis Ma'aser Sheni Ulahoitze Bikurim. Answers the Baraisa, answers the Tanach. I'll tell you why. Marbani Ma'aser Sheni, because she yesh lo heter b'chol meishavos. This Ma'aser Sheni, even after you brought it in Yerushalayim. See, before you bring Ma'aser Sheni in Yerushalayim, it's redeemable. That's the whole pasuk in Me'ei, right? But once you bring it in Yerushalayim, normally now you have to consume it in Yerushalayim. But there's an exception. Right, this Tana holds that there is a time, even after Ma'aser Sheni is brought in Yerushalayim, that it will become permissible to take it outside Yerushalayim. Where do we have such a case? So this is Kidder Rabbi Elazar. Now, obviously, these are not the words of the Braisa, because this Rabbi Elazar is the Amoida, like Rabbi Elazar ben Padas the Kohen. But the Gemara is explaining that Kidder Rabbi Elazar, that we'll quote in a moment. So there is a time where Ma'aser Sheni could become allowed to be consumed anywhere, wherever we dwell. Or Moitzani Bikurim, because Bikurim may never be taken out of Yerushalayim. In other words, we have a ribui from matzahs matzahs. What we have the exclusionary word of matzahs can only be that which is consumed b'chol ma'ishvei only that which could be consumed b'chol ma'ishvei may be used for matzahs. So Gamalda can make sense to exclude bikurim because bikurim taka may never be taken out of Yerushalayim. Now, what is the sheet of Rabbi Elazar? The Amar Rabbi Elazar minayin l'ma'aser sheni shenitma. Once it became tamei, then you could redeem it. Afila Yerushalayim means obviously if the produce became tamei before you brought it into Yerushalayim, then you can always be played to the ma'aser sheni. Right? You have to add a chaimish if you are the original owner. But you can be played. Once it goes inside Yerushalayim, that's his chiddush that he was megala dadin. He didn't make it up. You know, it's the Tan of the Braisa also subscribes to the same din. He's the one that taught it to us that you can redeem it even in Yerushalayim. How do we know that? Because it says, again, quoting the pasuk in the A regarding Ma'aser Sheni, the pasuk begins that the chiyir b'mamucha haderech ki lo yisuchal se'esoi. The pshat is that you are unable to carry it. So he darshans that the word se'esoi doesn't only mean to carry it, but the word se'es is a remes to eating. Punkt Ashgacha Pratis, we just had this in Parshas Miketz. Shnemen, as it says, right after Binyamin was brought to Yosef, and he fed everyone a meal, and he gave to Binyamin 5 meals, 5 portions, Vayisam Masois Me'es Panav. And he took portions from before him, and he gave it to the brothers, and to Binyamin he gave 5 portions. So since the Torah referring to food uses the words Masois, so the pshat in the pasuk is that when the pasuk is speaking about pidyon ma'aser sheni, one of the justifications to be pointed it is when loisuchal se'eser, when you can't eat it anymore. Why would you not be allowed to eat it? It's in Yerushalayim because it became tamei. It means even though it's in Yerushalayim, the pasuk in the A that's teaching us the dinim of pidyon ma'aser sheni includes a heter pidyon, even though it's inside Yerushalayim. Okay. Nakuda. So even if this Ma'aser Sheni does not become tamei, but since if it would become tamei, you can redeem it. So therefore, theoretically, again, you can eat Ma'aser Sheni b'chol ma'ishvei sechem, and the matzos riba is being marba Ma'aser Sheni. Now the whole thing, obviously, not Rabbi Yossi Aglili. You know, we're just putting together the 2 brises we learned today, because according to Rabbi Yossi Aglili, Ma'aser Sheni may not be eaten in Yerushalayim. I know it's from another limud. It's because of the oinim and an aleph. But this Braisa is not Rabbi Yossi Aglili. Man shomet like the Amar Ma'aser Sheni. Yes, not like you can be Yossi in the mitzvah. That's only Rabbi Akiva. Okay, so now that we established that the author of the Braisa is Rabbi Akiva, on Amad Aleph we learned that Rabbi Akiva doesn't allow you to use bikurim from the hekesh. No hekesh is mentioned here. Nevertheless, bikurim b'mirchol ma'ishvei sechem. What happened to his mal matzah shumareidim is indeed shamamina that Rabbi Akiva changed his mind from the hekesh. But again, he holds of the din, but from the b'chol ma'ishvei sechem, gewaldig. Okay. Fragt die Gemara, Rabbi Yossi HaGalili, right? Rabbi Yossi HaGalili, what did we learn on Amud Aleph in the bottom? That Rabbi Yossi HaGalili asks, how do I know that you can't eat bikurim? You can't make matzah out of bikurim from the B'chol Moishvei. Hold on, why did it need to have a new limud? Why doesn't he use the same limud that he used on top of the Amud? Which is that you cannot eat it ba'aninus. Beautiful. Why doesn't he exclude the permissibility of making matzah out of bikurim from the same lechem oini l'Rabbi Yossi HaGalili ayin aleph mishenachol ba'oini can be used from matzah yotza zem. That kasha is based on the havamina that the bikurim may not be eaten by an oinen she'ein nechol ela b'simcha. Says the Gemara, I'll tell you why. Because Rabbi Yossi HaGalili does not subscribe to that. Rabbi Yossi, Ma'aser Sheni cannot be eaten in aninus. Bikurim can be consumed by a kohen, even if, God forbid, the kohen is in a state of aninus. Savar lei kirab Shimon. And the Tanach holds that bikurim are asurim to be consumed by an oinen, but Rab Shimon is matir. So since Rabbi Yossi HaGalili holds like Rab Shimon, he needs to have the new limud of B'chol Moishvei to exclude bikurim matzah. Now, my Talmud Rabbanan, let's analyze this machlokes tanoim, because it says Lo suchal, right? That's again the pasuk in A. Lo suchal lechol b'shorecha. Now the pasuk goes on to a whole list of things. Ma'aser digoncha, v'tiroshcha, v'yitzorecha, u'b'choyres b'korcha, v'tzoynecha, v'chol nidorecha asher tidor, v'nidvoisecha, and the pasuk ends utrumas yodecha. So all of these items are mentioned in the same pasuk. Now, what is trumas yodecha? Not truma. Trumas yodecha in this pasuk goes to bikurim, like Rashi says, because it says yodecha, not truma. And where do we have the word yad? Zot Rashi, that since regarding bikurim it says the lokach hakoyin hatene mi yodecha pashas chisavoi. So whenever the Torah uses the words yad, it's being megale that this truma is referring to bikurim. And since, as we just mentioned, the pasuk counted together all of these meiser and at the end bikurim, so now we have a hekesh between bikurim and meiser. This is meiser sheni. What do we use with the hekesh? That ma meiser asur lo'oinen, as it says explicitly lo yechalti va'oini mimenu, af bikurim asur lo'oinen. That's the reason of the Tanakama. However, Rav Shimon says that truma korino rachmana. Yeah, I get it. I'm asking that trumas yodecha means bikurim, but the Torah calls it truma. So if you want to make a hekish, don't be makish from this one pasuk to meiser sheni. Adarabba, be makish to its own name. You're calling it truma, so fine. So bikurim is like truma. And what's the din of a truma? That a kohen is allowed l'kula alma to eat his truma or his fellow kohen's truma, right? If it's gifted to him or if he bought it, even if he's in a state of aninus. That the Torah again, truma korino rachmana. So we learn that kit truma, ma truma materes loinen, apikorim muter loinen. I v'Rav Shimon that mehida hekesh leislei. Right, we don't use this hekesh to meiser sheni. I simcha mia michtav ksividu. The Torah does use the word simcha regarding bikurim, where it says in Pashas Kisava regarding bikurim v'somachta b'chol hatoif. And should that not itself exclude someone who's not in a state of simcha, dahainu and oinan? So the Gemara says no. That the Torah in Kisava uses v'somachta in reference to bikurim, but that's not telling you about the state that the kohen must be in, but that's speaking about the time that a person fulfills bikurim in its fullest measure. Fullest measure means not only does he have to bring it, but he also reads all of the beautiful psukim that should be read, but only bisman hasimcha. What's bisman hasimcha? We'll see during the time of harvest. Ahul isman simcha da'asa. Detnan, Mishnah bikurim, that matzeres vadachag, maybe vikoira, which is the ideal. And why is that? Because that's the harvesting time. That's the samachta. That's bisman simcha. Now, if a person did not bring the bikurim up until Sukkot, they're not off the hook. They have to bring it up until Chanukah. Elamah, since it's no longer considered zman simcha, then they don't read the psukim in the Torah. Beautiful. Okay. So all of this is just closing up, is that Rabbi Akiva was Haderbei from the Hekesh Matzah Sumaroid, but everyone subscribes Bikurim cannot be matzah. Whether Maisa Sheni can be made into matzah and consumed in Yerushalayim, that we learned, that's the machloikis we have today. Rabbi Yossi Aglili Zoknish may not, it's not, you can't eat it ba'aninos, it's not going to be lechem oini, it has to be lechem that you can eat even in aninos, and no, Rabbi Akiva holds that you can actually eat Maisa Sheni Dika matzah, obviously as long as you eat it inside Yerushalayim. Okay, so now that we learned the lechem oni, the Rabbi Akiva's lechem oini, to exclude matzah ashira, now we're going to learn other limudim from the fact that the Torah calls matzah oini. So Tan Rabban and lechem oini, what does lechem oini also exclude? Prat lechalut. Chalut is that they would scald the flour, they would burn it, they would put it, they would throw boiling hot water over it before they would knead it. And that is a way of preparing breads in a more elegant manner. So it's a rich man's bread, not because of the ingredients, but because of the way you prepared it. So matzah, if it was chalut before you kneaded it, it's not good for the mitzvah of matzah. It's not going to be lechem ani from aninus, from poor, from oini, from ani, from poor. Likewise, says the Braisa, that lechem oini does not allow you to have a ashisha. Now, ashisha, again, it's not that there is different ingredients, nor was it prepared right by first scalding it. Ashisha means very large loaves. Poor people cannot afford these huge, humongous loaves. It has to be, what we would call an average matzah. If it's very, very big, that's something that was only eaten by the wealthy. It's not lechem oini. You want to go to poor, let's make it really poor. What's the most inferior type of bread? Maybe you should only be yotze elava pas hadra. Pas hadra means pas that the hadar, that its beauty was removed. What removes completely the beauty of bread? What is the most inferior bread? Holy bread, bread that has bran in it. So maybe matzah should only be allowed if it's a taka bran, if it's whole wheat. Lachamani. So Talmud Loiman here, weiter, we have since matzah. Matzah is, it's written many times, that does add riba, and therefore, Vafilu kematzah shel Shloima HaMelech, the wealthiest man, he for sure sifted out all of the bran from the grain. In other words, he had the opposite of whole grain. He had fine flour. As long as it's not very large, as long as he didn't scald it, as long as he didn't knead into it, yayin shemen udvash, right? It's still ani enough. It's poorest man, it's flour and water. But I don't care if it's refined. I am kain matam of lechem oini against lechem oini is only prat either lachalut or laashisha. Now, umay mashma says the Gemara that the hayashisha lishna the chashivusa. It's a lashon of something that has more chashivus, because it says, and this is a pasuk that we have in Shmuel regarding what happened when the Aron HaKodesh was returned to Yerushalayim, and there was a great festivity, and vayichalik l'chol ha'am, there was a Aron Kodesh bill that was passed by the government, and there was a stimulus, and everyone was given l'chol ha'amoin Yisrael l'meish v'adisha, right? Leish was given chalas lechem atzos. Everyone was given first a normal piece of bread, and then everyone was given eshpar echad. We'll see what that means. It's wow. It's a wow what they gave to every single person, and they gave every person a yashisha achas. Now, for Amar Rab Chanan bar Abba, what's eshpar? Eshpar was echad mishisha b'par. Can you imagine? Every Jew got a sixth of an ox. Right? I know that a zaitel, I think, is like a quarter, but did you ever see a zaitel? Add to that, I mean, they take away a little bit. That's how much meat every Yid was given. Can you imagine? How did you eat that? They had no refrigeration. No, they made a big simcha. And ashisha, that's where we see that ashisha is a very large bread. It's echad mishisha be'efa. A sixth of an ephah, guys, is one loaf of bread that's going to be, let's say, 6 pounds, 7 pounds, 8 pounds. Do you know how big that one loaf of bread is? Okay, so that's where we see that ashisha, it's a wow. It's not about what ingredients went into it, but it's the size of the bread. However, you should know that applies to Shmuel. That Shmuel says that in that pasuk in Shmuel, ashisha was not the size of the bread. Actually, the pasuk writes in the beginning that they gave everyone chalas lechem matzah, achas. It's not a tiyufta, okay? But you know, what's it? They gave him a normal piece of bread, and then they gave them this huge loaf. Just give them the huge loaf. So he holds Shmuel. No, they gave everyone a normal piece of bread, and they gave everyone a sixth of a bowl. They gave a tremendous amount of meat, and ashisha means gadol b'dacham, a jug of wine. That makes sense, you know, bread, meat, and wine. And where do we have that word? As it says in Hosea, that the Oyahavai Ashishai Anovim. And in that pasuk, the word Ashishai is connected to wine, connected to grapes. Okay, we have time, Chavra. Let's start a new Braisa. Now, the initial understanding of the Braisa will completely change, but halachically, we are going to pasken something connected to this initial understanding. Says the Braisa, Ein oifen pas ava, and let's read the Pesach. And we'll see that this brackets of the Yom Tov, or parentheses, is taka of great significance. And the Havamina, this is not a din in Yom Tov. This is a din in Pesach, that you're not allowed to make a matzah that's ava, that's thick. How thick, we'll see in a moment. What's the issue with making a very thick loaf of matzah? Because if it's thick, especially in the ovens of old, right, it's going to have to bake a lot slower. When something is very thick, if you put the fire on too hard, too strong, so then the outer part is going to get fabrent and the inside is going to remain raw. So it's going to take so much time for it to get properly baked that maybe it's going to, in the Bible, turn into chametz. It's a chametz issue. So holds Rabbi Shammai, Daf Lamed Zayin. However, Ubei Silol Matirim, they allow for you to make a thick bread. Now, even though Beisilol is matir, there has to be a limit, even the Beisilol. So Vikama Pas Ava, how thick may it be le Beisilol? Because there will be a time it's so thick, if it baked, it took so long, it became chametzik. So Amarafuna Tefach, that's the max that we allow le Beisilol. Why would he allow you to make it a tefach thick? Because she came with sinu b'lechem apanim. The lechem apanim we know was like we just mentioned today. Other than the two exceptions, everything in the Beis Hamikdash was never allowed to be chametzik, including the lechem apanim. The lechem apanim bread was a tefach thick, so you see that you can make a bread that's a tefach thick, and it won't become chametzik. And in Mamish, as we learned on Amud Aleph, it's beautiful today's daf that how can you speak about Kahanim? They were Zerizim. So Maskevlo Rabbi Yosef, how can you Rafuna understand that tefach from the lechem apanim? How can you compare making matzah that's done by anyone? He says im yoimru im amru b'zerizim. They were taka diligent. They knew how to make sure it doesn't become chametzik. Is yoimru b'sheinam zerizim? He's not done. He says im amru ba'pas amela b'chlal in Menachos. We have this gavaldik Mishnah on daf ayin vav that all of the grain that was used for Menachos, they were rubbed. You remember 300 times. Then they were pounded 500 times. They mamish all of the preparatory steps that was made when it came to the flour being used in Menachos were done to make it of the greatest quality. But this type of rubbing and pounding, taka does not allow it to become chametzik that quick. Adarabah, that type of prep is what prevented it from becoming chametzik. Is yoimru when it comes to making matzah that it can be done with the bread, even if it's not a melad, even if it's not really thoroughly worked through. There you have a much bigger chashash. Furthermore, im amru in the Beis Hamikdash that they only used eitzim yevation to bake. Eitzim that are dry are of much better quality. Is yoimru be'eitzim lachem? We are allowed to use eitzim lachem, but they don't heat up as quick as. Furthermore, im amru and the Beis Hamikdash, there the ovens were being used 24/7. It's used the whole time. You had all of the karbanos, so the ovens were already very hot when you put it in, or the heat was properly spread all over when you put it in. So even though it was thick, we knew it's for sure not going to become chametzik. You even know that when you make matzah, there's no halacha that you have to have already a preheated oven. You can do it b'tanur tzainon. So until it gets warm, and if the bread is very thick, again, there's a greater chashash it will become chametz. And the final, im amru b'tanur shel mateches, as were the tanurim in the holy Beis Hamikdash, is yoimenu b'tanur shel cheres. By the way, this whole idea of mateches has to do, we mentioned just a few days ago, that it's the walls of a keli absorbs the tam, and you have always an issue of naisar, especially if the tanur is considered the klei sharis, v'chulei v'chulei. But anyways, in the Beis Hamikdash, to prevent all that, they made things out of mateches that could be kasher. but we don't have to bake a matzah only in mateches. It can be cheres, and cheres is not as hot as, it's not as good as. So therefore, you b'chlal didn't understand the Braisa. Let's chaparine the answer. So Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba. I want you to know that when I learned this Braisa, I couldn't understand it. What's the issue over here? And I asked my teacher in private. Sheiltis as Rebbe, my teacher. Now, who was the Rebbe of Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba? So remember this, that was Rav. There's another version that it was Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba in the name of Rav. He's quoting his teacher Rav. When Rav learned his Braisa, he didn't understand the Braisa. And therefore Rav asked Rav's teacher, Sheiltis es Rebbe b'yichud, and who was the Rebbe of Rav? Rabbi Rabbeinu HaKadosh, Uman Rabbeinu HaKadosh. And they asked him, what's the machlokes b'sham and b'silo? And whoever did it, whether it was Rav or whether it was Rabbeinu HaKadosh, he says, nah, you didn't understand the whole Braisa. Braisa is not speaking about Pesach. Braisa is not speaking about the thickness of the matzah. The Braisa is speaking about a din in Yom Tov. You cannot work on Yom Tov for after Yom Tov. I need to have one loaf of bread on Yom Tov. Now, once I'm already doing the work and I'm filling up the oven, I want to put in 10 loaves of bread. But I don't need all 10 loaves of breads. But there is an upside, which is that when the oven is filled with bread, right, the heat spreads around better, and all of the breads get baked better. So does that justify me adding more bread on Yom Tov, even though I don't need it for Yom Tov, because each individual bread, including the one that I will eat on Yom Tov, will be of a greater quality? That's the machlokes b'shamay and b'silo. It's called pas meruba. Can you break more loaves than you need on Yom Tov? Now hold on, didn't the Braisa use the words ava? Yeah. So explain the Rav or explain the Rebbe, yeah. Because whenever you're baking a lot of bread, the dough is going to be thick. Bishum the nefisha belisa. What's going to have a thick dough? That's one shot. And the say that Ba'asvei, the Haitana, whoever authored this Braisa, whenever someone baked a lot of bread, the lashon that was used, pas avakarile. But it has nothing to do with Pesach. It's a Yom Tov Dike issue. And my tamam, this is a Beishamai, Imishum de Tanach Tircha de Loit Tzarech, which is taka his reason, because since Rabbi Shammai holds you don't need all those loaves of bread, you can't make it on Yom Tov. So then, why were they speaking about Pesach? My Yidiyah Pesach, Afilu Yom Tov Nami. And by the way, now you appreciate the parentheses we had in the last line of Lamed Vav Amud Beis. Some people taka had the Girsa of Yom Tov, but the kasha is on those who had the Girsa of the Pesach. So the Gemara says, Einach Hanami. The issue is not Pesach related, it's a broader question. And even if the Gir says, the Pesach, the Haitana b'Yom Tov shel Pesach koi. This is a series of Braisas speaking about Pesach. Pesach is Yom Tov. So they wanted to know, can you make Pas Merub on Pesach? But Einach Hanami, the kasha is throughout all the Yom Tovim, and it's a machlekes b'shamay. They said, well, then just get one more line in. Tanya Nami Yochim b'shamay yoimnim, ein oifen Pas over b'Yom Tov. Clearly it's about Yom Tov. And now let me just conclude by saying the following: that even though the Gemara concluded that the machlokes b'shamay and b'silul is not about a matzah issue, chametz, it's about working extra tircha on Yom Tov, and here b'silul is the one that says you are allowed to do it, like we spoke out as the Rishonim say, because when you add more loaves in the oven, every loaf comes out better. So on that, there's a big machlokes in the Pesachim whether we apply this today halacha l'maisa, because the ovens today are much better than the ovens of old. And if the reason of Beis Shammai does not apply, which is very possible in many modern day ovens, that the heat gets spread out the same, it doesn't make a difference whether you put many loaves of bread or not, then Beis Hillel will also be moida that there's no justification for the tircha yisera, as paskins many, but you can't bake on Yom Tov for after Yom Tov, you can't pack up the oven. And interesting, even more interesting, is that this question of making thick matzahs is taka brought down in halacha. And you have many poskim that say, even though the Gemara types the Braisa differently, know that you may not make a overly thick matzah. Actually, one of the reasons for which we were machmer the whole Gebraks, as the Alter Rebbe writes, is because if you're making a thick matzah, then it's taka possible that even though when flour, even flour gets burnt in the oven, it can never become chametz declated even with mixed with water. But that's only if it gets properly, so to say, ovened. If it gets baked in the oven, if it gets fired up. But if the matzah was very thick, then inside the matzah there can be a shtickle of flour. Flour, not though flour, but it wasn't properly ovened up. And now, if later it becomes wet, it will become chametz dik. All of that has to do with the thickness of the matzah, which is why many places can advocate for you to get the thinnest matzah possible. Because the thinner the matzah, the more secure we are that all of it properly got baked in the oven. And many people pay a lot of money for it. People who buy the very thin matzah should know that it's not just about whatever they think it's tastier or easier to eat. It also has to do with the kashrut standard of making sure that no dough remained in it, that it got more thoroughly baked. Benegei dinim of chametz itself, God willing, to be continued.
Yeah.
Now we're into Pesachim. Easy. Ashrei.
Yeah. Mamash Pesachim.
Thank you.